In the summer of 1942, the Axis forces in southern Russia recommenced their offensive by launching attacks across the Don Steppe, heading towards the Caucasus and the Volga. At the outset, these attacks gained significant territory. Due to a poorly executed offensive in May, the Soviet front became weakened and eventually crumbled. However, as Axis armored units and infantry advanced across the plains, Soviet forces, retreating chaotically, managed to regroup and engage in crucial delaying actions. These occurred in Rostov, Voronezh, and most notably, in the sharp curve of the Don River. These actions, along with confusion and uncertainty of the German high command, allowed for a defensive stand to be established on the western bank of Volga. The chosen location was a vast industrial city that controlled river traffic as well as the road and rail connections to the south. The Battle of Stalingrad was to be a decisive turning point of World War II. As the fight for the city developed, both Hitler and Stalin became locked in a contest of wills. Amid the rubble and carnage, their forces fought for streets, houses, sometimes even rooms. As winter set in, the Soviet counteroffensive began, resulting in the devastation of Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian armies and the encirclement of the formidable German Sixth Army. By the spring of 1943, when the dust settled over the Don Steppe and the charred remains of Stalingrad, Hitler's war of expansion had transformed into a battle for mere survival. In Stalingrad, his objective had been to shatter the Red Army at the outmost edge of its retreat, but instead, he had nearly shattered the Wehrmacht itself. For the Red Army, the battle represented much more than a significant victory. It marked an unmistakable turning point in every sense. Morale was restored, officers and men enjoyed a new status and respect, and the dark cloud of failure that had dogged the army for many years was dispelled. The battle also signified the commencement of the westward march, the gradual reconquest of Russia, and the advance through Eastern Europe towards the gates of Berlin. During Operation Barbarossa, Hitler had initially aimed to conquer the Soviet Union in a single-seasons campaign. However, by December 1941, the Red Army had not been decisively defeated, Moscow had not fallen, and a significant portion of the southern industry and agriculture remained beyond his reach. Now, he confronted a novel and unfamiliar challenge. He had not formulated any plans or preparations for a winter campaign, and no major offensives could be considered until the spring of 1942. Until then, his soldiers would have to hold the line, confronting the inevitable counterattacks while supplies of winter clothing, ammunition, and low-temperature lubricants were hastily sent forward. When the first supply trains reached the front, they were met enthusiastically by men bowed down by acute shortages of essential supplies, by chronic immobility, and by the cold. But the respite was not to last. The German armies in Russia were at the extreme limit of their extension. A considerable distance from their primary supply depots and susceptible to a swift counteroffensive, the situation was far from favorable. The blow arrived earlier than anticipated. On December 6th, the Russians launched an attack across a 600-mile stretch of the front. In the initial stage, the Soviet objective was to eliminate the German bulges to the west of Leningrad and both to the north and south of Moscow. As a result of relentless pressure, the Germans were slowly pushed back. However, there was no definitive breakthrough, and in January, bolstered by their initial achievements, Stalin ordered a comprehensive offensive. Initially, the attacks made good ground. Soviet pincers closed around Demyansk and Vyazma, and threatening attacks were made towards Smolensk and Bryansk. But despite these early successes, the Soviet offensive soon ran out of steam. By March, the Germans have recovered, stabilized their lines, and secured the neck of the Vyazma pocket. Only at Demyansk was there any serious prospect of a major Soviet victory. Here, a large part of the German 16th Army had been surrounded. However, Hitler was unwavering in his refusal to authorize a withdrawal and instead commanded that the 92,000 men trapped within the encirclement hold their positions. Over the course of 10 weeks, the besieged forces received supplies via airdrops, allowing them to launch repeated attacks on all sides of the encirclement. Finally, by the end of April, a land corridor to the west was established. With the arrival of spring, both sides readied themselves for the resumption of the offensive. The German High Command opted to stabilize the front near Kharkov in preparation for larger operations in the summer. Unbeknownst to them, the Russians chose to launch an attack through the same sector, maintaining pressure in the south. Kharkov had been occupied in October 1941 and had already seen one Soviet counterattack. This had been carried out as part of Stalin's January offensive, and had left the Russians holding a vulnerable salient on the west bank of the Donets. On May the 12th, the Russians opened their offensive with concentric attacks on either side of Kharkov. In both sectors, the attacking forces managed to breach the defenses, posing a significant threat to the city. In reaction, the Germans expedited their preparations for a counteroffensive, commencing it just 5 days later. Advancing to the north, German armored units led a thrust into the narrow part of the bulge, effectively isolating and cutting off the entire Soviet left flank. In the closing days of May, the Kharkov pocket was methodically diminished. Out of those who had been encircled, only 22,000 were able to break free. Tragically, 70,000 Russian soldiers perished, and an additional 200,000 were captured as prisoners of war. Nearly all of the Soviet equipment that had been engaged in the battle was either destroyed or left behind. The battle was a disaster for the Red Army, comparable of the great defeats of the first year of the war. The whole of their southern wing had been shattered. Large portions of the front were now under the control of the understrength units, or those that had lost contact with their command and communication centers. The Germans considered the battle a much larger success than they initially understood. With the elimination of the Kharkov salient, they were poised to launch another offensive into the south, oblivious to how significantly the opposing forces had been weakened. In fact, as June began, the vast expanses of the Don Steppe and the Caucasus were nearly undefended. For Hitler, the conquest of Russia was an overriding priority. If Germany was to survive and prosper, she would need to achieve self-sufficiency in food, fuel, and raw materials. These would have been won by force of arms and incorporated within an ever-expanding Reich. Only in Russia could Hitler hope to find the vast resources necessary to liberate Germany from reliance on external sources. However, Hitler's ambitions for Russia contradicted not only the common morality, but also common sense. His plan involved territorial conquest followed by a brutal program of Germanization, where subjugated populations would either become serfs or face extermination. In many parts of Western Russia, where the initial German invaders were greeted as liberators, this approach would ultimately foster resentment and resistance. In the unconquered territories to the east, it merely strengthened resolve. In earlier campaigns, the General Staff had been able to exert a restraining influence, curbing, though not controlling, Hitler's extravagance. But with each great victory, their influence had declined, as his confidence had soared. Convinced that his extraordinary intuition could replace the need for a traditional army leadership, he began to meddle more frequently in operational planning and the day-to-day management of campaigns. By 1942, he had taken on the role of Commander-in-Chief of the Army. Alongside his other titles as Führer, Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, and Minister of War. This position granted him immense power, unrestricted by any concerns of moral responsibility. Yet in the East, his plans and perceptions were colored by cruel prejudices and pathological hatreds. In them lay the seeds of disaster. By 1928, Stalin had emerged as Lenin's heir and the undisputed master of Russia. Being suspicious, vindictive, and cruel, his rise to power marked the commencement of an era characterized by widespread repression. During this time, the state apparatus would progressively infiltrate every aspect of Soviet society. In the 1930s, he initiated a swift program of industrial expansion, boosting armaments production and enlarging the Red Army. In 1937, with these processes underway, he initiated a series of purges of the Red Army's officer corps, simultaneously extending political surveillance and control of the army through the commissariat and the secret police. These actions, while significantly boosting the army's peacetime size, severely undermined its operational efficiency and had a profoundly negative impact on morale. A lackluster performance against the Finns in 1939 was a foreshadowing of a disastrously ineffective defense against the Wehrmacht. In July, as German forces advanced almost unopposed through Western Russia, Stalin assumed overall command of the Soviet armed forces. In this role, he enforced an inflexible policy of no retreat, leading to a series of military disasters of unprecedented scale. When winter arrived, he regained some initiative, but by committing his limited reserves excessively, he failed to fully exploit the fatigue and disarray affecting the Wehrmacht. By the spring of 1942, he had squandered more than 6 million lives, yet appeared neither distressed nor despondent. Stalin's authority was now based almost entirely on fear. Thousands of Red Army officers had already been shot for disobedience, desertion, or treason. Those who remained understood that their very lives hinged on achieving operational victories, and that they would shoulder the blame for any failures. Hitler's campaign in Russia had not only severely stretched the Wehrmacht, but also had imposed tremendous strains on Germany's industry and disrupted its economy. Temporary measures were implemented to optimize production and ensure an uninterrupted supply of resource to the front lines. But the underlying problem remained. Germany's resources was simply inadequate to the prosecution of a long war. In the planning of Barbarossa, Hitler had established clear objectives. The capture of Leningrad would secure the Baltic and connect Germany to her Finnish allies. Securing control of the Moscow region was crucial for establishing German supremacy over the road and rail networks while cutting off the Red Army's communication lines. However, it was the south where the most significant economic gains were anticipated. The fertile grain fields of Ukraine were seen as the future breadbasket of the new Reich. Furthermore, the abundant mineral resources of the Donbass region and the oil fields of the Caucasus were expected to supply the essential resources and raw materials needed to sustain an indefinite war effort. In the event, the offensive had fallen far short of its aims. The repulse before Moscow had been perhaps the greatest military setback, but it was the failure in the south that most concerned Hitler. Although the original objectives of Barbarossa still remain valid for future conquest of the Soviet Union, Hitler knew that his armies were too weak to achieve them all in a single year. Immediate priority had to be given to the south. Only by securing his fertile and economically rich region could he be assured of the means to continue the war. In April, he outlined his plans for the main campaign of 1942. This would be codenamed Plan Blue, and would take the form of a two-pronged offensive. The overarching goals of Operation Blue included the annihilation of the Red Army's southern front, the establishment of control over the territory west of the Volga River in Ukraine, and the seizure of the valuable Caucasus oil fields. As the offensive drew near, a massive transfer operation was initiated to reinforce the existing divisions in the critical southern sector of the front. In other sectors, the forces were reduced to 50% of their usual strength, and Hitler's allies' armies were stripped of as many spare divisions as they could provide. By June, 52 such divisions had been added to the order of battle in the east. These included units from Hungary, Romania, Italy, Slovakia, and even volunteers from Spain. Hitler would now have some 74 divisions available for the start of Plan Blue, 54 of them German. Of these, 9 were armored and 7 motorized. 8 additional divisions en route to the front were designated as strategic reserve. Furthermore, over half of the Luftwaffe's available forces in the Eastern Theater were to be deployed in battle. The offensive was meticulously planned to unfold in 3 distinct phases. This approach aimed to give the Germans control over the battle's direction and maximize the effectiveness of their limited forces. The vanguard of the attack would consist of the 4th Panzer Army with support from the 2nd Army and the 2nd Hungarian Army. These forces would advance from the region around Kursk toward Voronezh on the Upper Don. Once the Don had been reached, the infantry would dig in and consolidate the new front, while the 4th Panzer would turn south and continue to advance downriver. In the second phase of the offensive, scheduled to commence 2 days later, the 6th Army, positioned near Kharkov, would initiate an attack towards eastwards, then pivot parallel to the 4th Panzer Army, proceeding down the corridor between the Don and the Donets River. Phase 3 was planned for a few days later, where the 1st Panzer Army would launch an eastward and southward offensive, crossing the Donets River towards the Lower Don, with the 17th Army on its right flank and the 8th Italian Army held in reserve. These maneuvers were anticipated to result in a series of encirclement operations within the Donets corridor, in the sharp curve of the Don River, and between the Don and the Volga. While these encirclements were being executed, the left flank of the offensive would anchor itself along the Volga River, and the primary thrust would turn southward, in the direction of the Caucasus. The initial phase of Operation Blue was set to begin on June 28th. During the weeks leading up to the attack, supply deliveries were expedited, and troops and equipment were funneled into the designated battle area. In all likelihood, this represented Hitler's final chance to secure a decisive victory in the East. The outcome of Operation Blue would profoundly shape the future course of the war. In June, an eerie calm descended upon the Eastern Front. While the Germans completed their preparations for Blue, the Russians built up their defenses. The Soviet High Command knew that an attack was imminent. The only uncertainty was where and when the blow would fall. Stalin firmly believed that the German offensive would be initiated by Army Group Center, with Moscow as its ultimate objective. One conspicuous target was the large bulge, extending westward between Demyansk and Vyazma. The idea of eliminating this bulge was seen as almost inevitable, but it was likely to occur as a part of a border offensive or in preparation for one. Initially, Soviet strategists anticipated the primary attack coming from the 2nd Panzer Army, positioned near Oryol, and moving northeastward through Tula directed toward Moscow. However, information received by the Southwest and Bryansk fronts indicated an attack out of the Kursk region towards Voronezh and the Upper Don. The Soviet High Command believed this to be the spearhead of the main German summer offensive. They theorized that the goal of this offensive would be to disrupt the Southwest and Bryansk fronts. From Voronezh, the German forces would then advance north and east in a massive encirclement of the Moscow region. Stalin's unwavering focus on the defensive of Moscow at the expense of other areas on the front was rooted in political and military considerations rather than economic ones. Certainly, the Moscow region was an important center of industry upon which the Red Army depended, but its value as the nerve center of the Soviet Union was inestimable. Moscow served not only as the seat of government, but also as the hub of administration, communication, and the top command levels for both military and the state. In Russia, unlike most other countries, the centralization of power in the capital endowed it with strategic significance that far outweighed its economic or even military importance. As a result, defending Moscow was accorded the utmost priority, with the largest deployments of troops and equipment dedicated to its protection. In the spring, Stalin had abandoned the system of theater commands, relying instead on the loose coordination of individual fronts, of which there were 8 facing the 3 German army groups in the east. The defense of Moscow was entrusted to 3 fronts, the Northwest, Kalinin, and Western fronts. These forces represented well over half of the available frontline divisions in the Soviet order of battle. South of Moscow, particularly facing Kursk and Oryol, the Bryansk front and Southwest fronts contributed to an additional 20% of Russian strength. To counter the threat from this sector, Stalin had positioned 2 tank armies, the 3rd and the 5th, between Voronezh and the capital. To the west of Voronezh, 2 lines of fortifications extended southward and southeastward for 150 miles. In the designated sector, the southern and North Caucasus fronts were significantly undermanned, accounting for no more than 10% of frontline divisions. Their neglecting to reinforce this sector, Stalin had ordered fortifications to be constructed around Rostov, Stalingrad, and Saratov. In reserve, there were further 10 armies. These were stationed well behind the front, and concentrated around Voronezh and Moscow. Though still in the process of formation, many of these armies would play a central role in the battle to come. In keeping with his aristocratic Prussian origins, Fedor von Bock was an ardent nationalist and a stern disciplinarian. Promoted to the rank of Field Marshal in July 1940, he was given command of Army Group Center for the attack on Russia. As a soldier, Bock was taut and aggressive, qualities much admired by Hitler. But he was also uncommonly outspoken, a license Hitler extended only to those successful in battle. It was Field Marshal Bock's army group that bore the brunt of the winter counteroffensive, and his suggestion for a withdrawal led to his dismissal, along with nearly 40 senior generals, on grounds of defeatism. However, within a few weeks, the unexpected death of Field Marshal von Reichenau brought Bock back into favor. In January, Hitler appointed him as Reichenau's successor to lead Army Group South. Zhukov was one of the few senior officers in the Red Army who had survived the purges of the 1930s, and thus, he was among the limited number of generals with significant professional experience and training. In 1941, as the threat of war loomed, Stalin appointed Zhukov as chief of the General Staff. Alongside Marshal Timoshenko, who served as the Commissar of Defense, Zhukov was tasked with preparing the Red Army for battle readiness. With the surprising suddenness of the attack and the terrible reverses suffered on the frontier, both men were given front commands. Both proved able. Timoshenko in the south, Zhukov in the defense of Leningrad and Moscow. In 1942, however, their paths diverged. Timoshenko's decline in status commenced with the catastrophe at Kharkov, while Zhukov, celebrated as the hero of Moscow, ascended to become Stalin's most esteemed general. Zhukov was a vigorous and fearless military leader who expected unwavering dedication from his subordinates and significant sacrifices from his troops. Like Stalin, he was a natural fighter, committed to offensive operations regardless of the cost. At the gates of Moscow, the Wehrmacht had suffered the first serious reverse in its hitherto relentless march of conquest. Paralyzed in the grip of one of the coldest winters on record, and buffeted by incessant counterattacks, it had gradually been driven back. Yet although shaken, the front had held. Hitler's staunch refusal to authorize significant withdrawals undoubtedly prevented a complete rout and saved millions of marks worth of equipment. However, this came at the cost of hundreds of thousands of casualties. It wasn't until the end of March, when the spring thaws made further fighting impossible, that the Wehrmacht could assess its losses. Many of the divisions that had held the most vulnerable sectors of the front were reduced to just one-third of their standard strength. Thousands of tanks, trucks, and heavy weapons had either been lost to the ice or captured by the Russians. Out of the 162 divisions deployed in the east in April, only a third were considered fit for offensive operations, and of those, only 8 were considered fully combat ready. In the months leading up to Operation Blue, the divisions in the south were re-equipped and brought back to operational effectiveness, with a mix of fresh recruits and transfers from other areas. Mobility, however, remained an almost insurmountable problem. Despite its reputation as a modern mechanized army, the infantry divisions of the Wehrmacht relied almost exclusively on horses. Those were now in short supply. The harsh winter had significantly reduced their numbers, and when the replacements were available, they were not always of the highest quality. Above all else, the Achilles heel of Operation Blue would prove to be mobility. The available transportation resources were, at best, barely sufficient for the task at hand. There was no room for the kind of errors that inevitably occur in military operations. Even the panzer armies, which had been formidable in 1941, were now diluted, with the inclusion of infantry divisions seriously compromising their ability to execute large-scale operational encirclements. Despite its initial prominence in the early Blitzkrieg offensives, the Mark III tank was gradually becoming obsolete with the emergence of larger, heavier, and more powerfully armed tanks. Although fast, reliable, and agile, it had proved impossible to outgun the model sufficiently to maintain its leading role in the panzer forces. Nevertheless, production of the Mark III continued throughout 1942, while search for a replacement was underway. Mark III chassis, however, proved eminently suited to conversion as self-propelled guns. Dispensing with the turret enabled armor protection to be increased to as much as 80 mm on the longer recoil of heavier weapons contained within the body of the vehicle. The success of Operation Blue hinged on the presence of substantial concentrations on self-propelled guns in Mark III battle tanks. The Mark IV tank initially emerged in the 1930s as an infantry support tank and demonstrated its effectiveness against both infantry and artillery positions. However, in 1941, alarmed by the perceived superiority of Soviet tanks, Hitler ordered the immediate modification of the Mark IV to adapt it for anti-tank roles, as there was no viable alternatives at the time. This involved significant improvements in armor protection and the replacement of the short-barreled 75mm howitzer with a longer, high-velocity anti-tank gun. Suitably modified, the Mark IV gained a new lease on life and will remain in production until the end of the war. Given the significance the German army attached to its tank force, it was perhaps unsurprising that German anti-tank weapons would be exceptionally well designed. However, the gun that emerged as one of the most feared weapons in the German arsenal was initially conceived as an anti-aircraft gun. Its first use against tanks in the Spanish Civil War astonished artillery crews, who quickly realized that their 88mm anti-aircraft guns possessed a remarkable ability to destroy tanks, surpassing any other weapon then in service. The gun's high muzzle velocity and exceptional accuracy made it ideally suited for anti-tank roles. So much so that by 1940, all anti-aircraft guns were equipped with telescopic sights, and their crews were trained to engage enemy tanks effectively. In the early stages of the war against the Soviet Union, the Wehrmacht found its horror, but the only truly effective weapon it could deploy against the best Soviet battle tanks was the 88. Even in mid-1942, the 88 remained the Wehrmacht's anti-tank weapon in the East, and in the build-up to Blue, every panzer division would be given its own battalion of 88s for use against tanks or aircraft. Even in 1942, the Junkers Ju-87 remained one of the most effective aircraft available to the Luftwaffe. More commonly recognized as the Stuka, this aircraft had a significant impact on the initial campaigns before its combat limitations became evident during the Battle of Britain. When deployed to the Eastern Front with improved armament and enhanced armor protection, it found renewed effectiveness. While it remained outmatched by single-seat fighters, in skies controlled by the Germans, especially over the vast expanses of European Russia, the Stuka retained the capability to deliver devastating strikes. Whether in independent operations or supporting ground forces, Stukas would be extensively utilized in all stages of the campaign. The Luftwaffe's principal frontline fighter throughout World War II was the Messerschmitt Bf-109. The F-Series, introduced in spring of 1941, incorporated a number of improvements on the aircraft that had so narrowly failed in the Battle of Britain. With a redesigned fuselage, a new propeller, and larger, more powerful engine, the aircraft was significantly faster and possessed a higher service ceiling than its predecessor. In the first year of the war in Russia, Messerschmitt pilots achieved impressive scores, partly due to their own flying skill, but also because they had access to a vastly superior aircraft. In the Eastern Front, the Messerschmitt had yet to encounter a serious challenger. In the spring of 1942, the officers and soldiers of the Wehrmacht had ample reason to believe that their own efforts would ultimately lead to victory. While they were not as strong as they had been in the previous summer, neither were their adversaries. During their advance through Western Russia, they had decimated a significant portion of the Red Army, capturing or killing well over 6 million Russian soldiers and confiscating more equipment than factories of the Reich could produce in a year. They justifiably regarded the Red Army as a shambles, tactically incompetent at all levels, and redeemed only by the raw courage of its individual soldiers. By contrast, they saw themselves as seasoned professionals. Even those facing combat for the first time did so confident in their own abilities and in those of their comrades, underlying this conviction with a solid foundation of training and discipline. Thoroughly schooled in the techniques of modern warfare, German soldiers were also expected to demonstrate personal initiative. On the battlefield, the ability to respond quickly and effectively under pressure was highly valued. Soldiers at all levels were trained to be adaptable, to maintain awareness of the broader tactical situation, and to be capable of assuming commands beyond their own rank. In comparison to Western standards, discipline in the German army was stringent, with significantly higher expectations placed on a German soldier compared to his British or French counterparts. This approach yielded two predictable outcomes. This blend of forward-thinking and effective training, combined with extensive battle experience and high-quality modern equipment, had brought the Wehrmacht within striking distance of victory in 1941. In the end, the soldiers of the Wehrmacht had fallen victim to circumstances largely beyond their control. With the return of summer, they gathered their strength and prepared to resume the advance east. During the spring and early summer of 1942, the Red Army suffered a number of catastrophes, of which Kharkov was merely the largest and most damaging. In the Crimea, the Wehrmacht had suffered an additional loss of 200,000 men, along with substantial quantities of equipment. In the central and northern sectors, they had lost half as many again. Few other nations or governments could have endured such losses, but the Red Army and its leadership remained unbroken. This resilience was partly due to the seemingly limitless reservoir of Russian manpower and the unwavering ruthlessness of the Soviet government. Yet also it underscored the extent to which the Soviet Union had been geared up for war. In 1941, the German High Command was stunned by the sheer size of the Red Army and the volume of equipment it had captured in the early stages of the campaign. While much of it was obsolete, there was ample evidence that the Russians possessed a range of modern, highly effective weapons, and more concerning, the capacity to manufacture them in quantities beyond Germany's reach. Although many armaments factories had been overrun, others were saved, disassembled, and transported eastward, beyond the grasp of the Wehrmacht to rebuild. Though full production would not resume until 1943, enough was reaching the front to maintain the Army's defensive capability. Moreover, the experiences of the past year that forced a rationalization of the munitions industry. Obsolete weapons would be phased out, and those of proven value given priority of resources. Soviet tank designs, though often not given enough credit, had surpassed that of Germany by 1940. The focus of their efforts had been on heavy tanks, resulting in the exceptional KV-1. The KV-1 anticipated the need for increasingly thicker armor, making it, upon its initial appearance, the most heavily armored tank in the world and by far the most formidable for its time. Its main weakness, as is typical with heavy tanks, was its relatively slow speed and limited range. Additionally, it was relatively costly to manufacture, which meant that the KVs only constituted a small portion of Soviet tank forces. Widely recognized as one of the most successful tanks ever created, the T-34 achieved an outstanding balance among the three fundamental aspects of tank design: firepower, mobility, and protection. When it was introduced in 1940, its high-velocity 76.2mm gun outclassed the armament on German tanks. This, combined with superior armor protection, gave the T-34 a deadly advantage that it retained well into 1942. The T-34 was also ideally suited to the climate and conditions of Soviet Russia. An exponentially rugged suspension system and wide tracks gave it full mobility in all seasons and over all but the most impossible ground. On top of all these qualities, the T-34 also had the advantage of being cheap and easy to manufacture, and by the end of the war, over 53,000 would have been produced. More numerous than any other aircraft ever built, the Ilyushin IL-2 was one of the most successful ground attack fighters of the war. First flown in 1939, the single-seat prototype proved underpowered and underprotected. These faults were later remedied with the installation of a more powerful engine and the addition of a second crew member manning a rear machine gun. The IL-2, properly known as the Sturmovik, was a strikingly simple design that boasted over half a ton of armor and was among the earliest combat aircraft armed with rockets. While less sophisticated than many Western planes, it was highly regarded for its combination of survivability, exceptional handling in all conditions, and outstanding control at high attack angles. The Germans greatly feared the IL-2, and the Red Army considered it one of their most vital weapons. In June 1941, the most successful Russian fighter of World War II had only just begun production. Within weeks, the entire production line was relocated 1,000 miles to the east due to the advancing German forces. However, production quickly resumed, and by the end of the year, 500 Yak-1 models had been rushed into service. Like the Ilyushin, the Yak was known for its simplicity, solidity, reliability, and ease of maintenance. It also proved to be an exceptional fighter, particularly in later versions. The introduction of a more powerful engine led to the Yak-7, which replaced the Yak-1 in production from early 1942 onward. By the spring of that year, the Yak-9 was already in development, featuring increased armament. When it entered service in August, the Yak-9 would prove to be far superior to any existing German fighter. By the end of the war, these three models would account for 37,000 aircraft, the largest production runner fighters of that time. Even in 1942, although well-equipped, the Red Army was still disorganized and inefficient. Virtually nothing now remained of the 1936 officer cadre. Most of those lucky enough to survive the purges of the 1930s had been killed or captured in the first year of the war against Germany. Major operations were now commanded by men with little or no military training, and in some cases even less ability. Among senior officers, there was an almost complete lack of tactical subtlety, with little regard for life and an overwhelming reliance on the application of brute force. Throughout all levels of the army, discipline was increasingly enforced through fear, and what could be loosely described as morale was maintained through the crude yet relentless propaganda. The calls for even greater sacrifices didn't mention ideology. Instead, they directly appealed to the Russian soldiers' sense of history and patriotism. This marked a significant turning point in the war, an implicit acknowledgement of past successes and mistakes, and a reluctant recognition that the Red Army soldiers would fight harder and longer for Mother Russia than they would for socialism. In the battles ahead, they would need almost superhuman endurance. They couldn't match their adversaries in training and tactics. However, amidst the devastation of Stalingrad, they would achieve one of the most famous victories of the war through their own courage and determination. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, German armies prepared to resume their offensive. While in Crimea, they were engaged in the final stages of one of the most horrific sieges of the war. Since November of the previous year, the Soviet Black Sea port of Sevastopol had been besieged by two armies, the Romanian 3rd and the German 11th. The city was a natural fortress, situated among rocky bluffs, ravines, and steep cliffs. In 1941, its defenses had been strengthened with the 3 lines of fortifications, and its garrison had been reinforced with troops evacuated from southern Ukraine. Early German attempts to storm the city had made little headway, and much of the winter was spent in wearing down the Soviet defenses through air and artillery bombardment. In May, the Germans completed their clearance of the eastern Crimea, with the elimination of a threatening Soviet bridgehead on the Kerch Peninsula, thus enabling them to concentrate all their efforts on Sevastopol. To break through the labyrinth of defenses and reach the high ground dominating the harbor, the Germans brought up a fantastic array of heavy mortars and railway guns, amongst them some of the most awesome weapons ever built. While the capture of Sevastopol, the last pocket of resistance in the rear, would be liquidated. The capture of Sevastopol would free up about 200,000 Axis troops for service in other areas, significantly boosting morale throughout the Wehrmacht. In the lead-up to Operation Blue, Axis forces in Crimea continued their brutal siege of Sevastopol, subjecting the city to relentless air bombardment and artillery fire. In early June, German and Romanian infantry began penetrating the outer defenses and reached the harbor on June 20th, cutting off the supply routes to the garrison. For 2 more weeks, a torrent of fire rained down on the city, resulting in death and injury of thousands of soldiers and civilians. When the Crimea was eventually conquered in early July, and the remaining German and Romanian forces were freed for deployment further east, the Soviet death toll was incalculable due to the massive scale of the carnage and chaos. As the battle for Sevastopol neared its conclusion, preemptive actions were undertaken against Soviet positions east of Kharkov, with the goal of softening up the front in preparation for the launch of Operation Blue. By the end of June, Hitler had completed preparations for Operation Blue. He had assembled 74 divisions across 7 armies, along a line extending from Oryol in the north to Taganrog on the Sea of Azov. Most of these had recently been strengthened, some considerably, in anticipation of the coming offensive. Opposing them, the Soviet forces amounted to 15 armies grouped in 3 fronts. But these armies were normally equivalent to only 2 or 3 of the German divisions, and after Kharkov, many of them were in no fit state to fight. The first thrust of Plan Blue would be spearheaded by the 4th Panzer Army. Between Kursk and Oryol, General Hermann Hoth commanded the 4th Panzer Army, tasked with launching the drive towards Voronezh in the Upper Don. The 4th Panzer Army was comprised of 11 divisions, including 3 armored and 2 mechanized divisions. By reinforcing it with unmechanized infantry divisions, its strength was increased, albeit at the cost of speed and mobility. Supporting the 4th Panzer Army was Army Group Weichs, a German-Hungarian force led by General Maximilian von Weichs. This army group included his own 2nd Army, which he had commanded since 1940, and which now consisted of 1 motorized infantry division, 4 German divisions, and 2 Hungarian divisions. Additionally, the Hungarian 2nd Army was part of the Weichs group, featuring 4 Hungarian divisions. Facing these forces was the Soviet Bryansk Front, under the command of General Philip Golikov. The Bryansk Front was the strongest of the 3 fronts, and comprised 4 armies. Though relatively small in number, these forces were fresh, well-equipped, and had recently been reinforced by the 5th Tank Army in response to concerns about a potential attack in this sector. South of Kursk, the German 6th Army was assembling in the region between Kharkov and Belgorod. General Friedrich Paulus commanded the 6th Army, which had been substantially reinforced in preparation for Operation Blue. For the advance towards the Middle Don, Paulus had at his disposal 18 divisions, including 2 armored divisions and 1 mechanized division. Most of these divisions were veteran formations, and amongst the best in the German order of battle. Facing 6th Army was the Soviet Southwest Front. While the Southern Front was still under the command of Marshal Timoshenko, it had not yet recovered from the spring disasters and offered him little hope of a quick return to favor. Timoshenko's front included 5 armies, but they were all fatigued, weakened, and demoralized from their earlier failures outside of Kharkov. In the southern sector, General Paul Ewald von Kleist led the 1st Panzer Army, spearheading the attack across the Donets and Don rivers towards the Caucasus. The 1st Panzer Army consisted of 16 divisions, with most of them being unmechanized infantry, including 4 Romanian divisions. Supporting the 1st Panzer Army, under the command of General Richard Ruoff, was the 17th Army. This army had an additional 12 divisions, including 4 Romanian ones, again reflecting the dispersion of armored and mechanized units along the front. The Italian 8th Army, comprising 6 poorly equipped and unreliable divisions, served as the reserve. The Soviet Southern Front, led by General Rodion Malinowski, was responsible for defending the lower Donets and Don rivers. The Southern Front also included 5 armies, but it had suffered from heavy losses in the battle for Kharkov and remained below its establishment in terms of equipment and personnel. Disparities on the ground were mirrored by significant disparities in the air. In preparation for Operation Blue, the Germans concentrated most of their available aircraft in the southern theater, placing them under the operational command of the 4th Air Fleet. This would give them a high degree of coordination and concentration in the target sector. Lacking reliable intelligence of German intentions, the Red Army Air Force was more evenly deployed and grouped in a series of commands, loosely tied to the army fronts. Although technical improvements and mass production had at last given it a fighting chance against the Luftwaffe, its command structure remained awkward and its pilots still lacked confidence and skills. In many respects, Hitler's confidence in Operation Blue was not entirely without merit. He had superior forces in the south and still maintained the element of surprise. However, he had now committed almost all of his reserves. Far to the east, beyond the range of German reconnaissance, an additional 10 Soviet armies were being assembled. These forces would only be deployed as the crisis developed. Early on the morning of June 28th, mass concentrations of German artillery signaled the start of Operation Blue. Along the northern sector of the front, artillery guns roared while waves of aircraft flew overhead, executing carefully planned missions with precise targets. The Germans launched fierce attacks on airfields, communication centers, strategic towns, and military strongholds. Soviet reconnaissance aircraft were ruthlessly hunted down, eventually leaving the skies devoid of Soviet reconnaissance. A sense of shock and confusion gripped at the Bryansk front. In the sectors commanded by the 13th and 40 armies, German infantry and tanks were breaching the forward defenses, posing a threat to dislocate Golukov's left flank and disrupt the junction between the Bryansk and southwest fronts. By mid-morning, it became evident that this was a major operation, and dangerous gaps were emerging in the front line. While the 4th Panzer Army and its supporting infantry armies were cutting back into the Bryansk front, the second phase of Operation Blue was launched against Timoshenko's southwest front. Again, German infantry and armor crashed into 21st Army, further threatening the already perilously weak junction between Timoshenko's 21st and Golukov's 40th. Soon the whole front was in motion. In early July, 1st Panzer and 17th Army jumped off from their start lines west of the Donets. Everywhere the Russians fell back under the weight of the onslaught. By July 5th, forward elements of the 4th Panzer Army had reached the Don River near Voronezh and began advancing through the western suburbs of the city. Between Bryansk and the southwest fronts, there was now a gap over 150 miles wide, through which German second echelon formations were pouring. For the first time in the war, the Russians were not desperately trying to hold hopelessly exposed positions but were retreating in a relatively organized manner. German forces were closing in on stragglers and rear guards. But these were not the grand encirclements that Hitler had envisioned or that characterized previous German offensives. Despite the lack of a significant catch, Hitler believed that the Red Army was on the brink of collapse. Other assessments, however, suggested that the Red Army was learning how to fight a modern war. In Voronezh, remnants of the 40th Army put up a resistance for several days, and the hastily mobilized 5th Tank Army launched desperate attacks on the flanks of the 4th Panzer advance. While these attacks were ultimately futile, they bought crucial time for Timoshenko. He was able to pull back the battered armies of the southwest front to the Don Rivers line and deploy the first reserve armies into the battle. In the south, fighting for Rostov and the Don River crossings was even more intense. Malinowski, aware of Timoshenko's setbacks and fearing that his southern front would be enveloped from the north, conducted a skillful rearguard action while his armies escaped to the south. Angered by these delays and believing that the Soviet center had fallen apart, Hitler now made the first of a series of fundamental alterations to the plan. 4th Panzer was detached from the 6th Army, along with 6 armies on integral armored spearhead and sent south to assist 1st Panzer force a crossing of the lower Don. This diversion reduced 6th Army to a march, and further enabled the Russians to consolidate their positions along the line of the Don, and in the Don Bend. The decision to change their focus was particularly noteworthy because the Don steppe offered ideal tank terrain, unlike the challenging landscapes of the lower Don and the Caucasus. By this point, both sides had restructured their forces and adjusted their objectives. The overwieldy German Army Group South had been replaced by 2 smaller army groups. Army Group A consisted of both Panzer armies and the 17th Army, while Army Group B consisted of the 2nd Army, the 6th Army, minus its Panzer arm, the Hungarian 2nd Army, and the Italian 8th Army. This division of force signaled a strategic change of direction. Of the 16 armored and mechanized divisions in the field, Army Group A retained 15, while Army Group B was left virtually devoid of mobile forces and had an overly high number of Axis satellite divisions. Moreover, Army Group B had the challenging task of holding the Little Don River line, safeguarding Stalingrad on the Volga, and bearing the brunt of any potential Soviet counteroffensive. This was in contrast to the 3 mainly German armies of the Army Group A, which were advancing through the south into the Caucasus. Facing these forces were 4 Soviet fronts. The Bryansk front, reduced on its left wing, maintained its position east of Oryol. Positioned east from Voronezh, and guarding the northern part of the Don Bend, was the Voronezh front, which had been reinforced by 2 reserve armies during the intense battle for the city. In the Bend itself, and standing directly in the path of German Army Group B, a new front was being formed. The Stalingrad front comprised 3 reserve armies along with surviving elements of Timoshenko's southwest front. The Stalingrad front was charged with the defense of the Don Bend and the approaches to the Volga. On the lower Don and facing the full weight of Army Group A, the southern front was in the process of disengaging in preparation for a full-scale retreat. As the 4th Panzer approached the Don east of Rostov, the battle for the city was reaching its concluding phases. Barricades were erected throughout the city, and the Don River bridges were rigged for demolition. Soviet rear guards were positioned at every street corner, creating a unique challenge for the advancing Germans. This fighting retreat differed significantly from previous encounters during the German advance in Russia. It was a well-organized defense executed with skill and determination. Ultimately, Rostov fell to the Germans on July 23rd, allowing the core units of the southern front to escape to the south and east. With the Don crossing secured and the 6th Army's advance in the eastward sector slowing down due to the oppressive summer heat, Hitler adjusted his plans once again. He detached 2 armored and 3 mechanized divisions from the 4th Panzer to reinforce Paulus in the Don Bend. Simultaneously, he ordered the remaining infantry elements of 4th Panzer, along with its sole remaining armored division, to shift their focus northeastward and launch an attack across the Don steppe towards the Volga. While panzer units raced back and forth across the steppe, and German infantry troops marched and fought on the plains of southern Russia, Soviet forces in the Don Bend were strengthening their positions and preparing their defenses. Unbeknownst to Hitler, Stalin had issued orders to halt any further retreat in the east. The Red Army was to stand and fight. It fell back from the Don, it would not fall back beyond the Volga. In late July, 6th Army resumed its offensive in the Don Bend. Armored spearheads were driven into the flanks of the Soviet front, while the infantry maintained steady pressure in the center. In the northern sector, the attacks made good progress. Armored and mechanized units successfully penetrated the Russian defenses, cutting their way southeastward toward Kalak. Meanwhile, in the lower Don region, the southern pincer of the 6th Army launched a powerful assault against the junction of the 62nd and 64th Soviet armies. The fighting in the Don Bend continued relentlessly during the first 3 weeks of August. As the 6th Army advanced eastward, 4th Panzer made steady progress northward, pushing the front lines back towards the narrow strip of land between the Don and the Volga rivers. In early August, Stalin made another adjustment to the command structure in the southern theater of operations. The Stalingrad front was reduced from 6 armies to 4, with 2 of these, the 38th and 28th Armies, being reinforced from the Armored Reserve and designated as tank armies. Additionally, the newly formed Southeast Front comprised 4 armies and was positioned directly in the path of not only the 6th Army, but also the 4th Panzer Army. By August 10th, General Paulus had largely completed the clearance of the Don Bend region directly west of Stalingrad. However, in the northern sector, the Russians still maintained control over several significant positions on the western bank of the Don River. These stubbornly defended positions proved extremely difficult to eliminate, causing further delays in Paulus's eastward advance. For Hitler, the campaign to reach the Volga was proving to be a much lengthier endeavor than he had initially anticipated, and was becoming a cause for serious concern amongst the German high command. In contrast, the progress of German Army Group A was startling. After jumping off from its bridgeheads on the lower Don on July the 25th, it had fanned out on a broad front. While the 17th Army veered westward toward the Black Sea, the 1st Panzer Army launched an attack in the south and east, swiftly advancing through territory largely abandoned by Russian forces. On August 9th, the leading units of the 1st Panzer Army reached the northern foothills of the Caucasus, covering a distance of over 300 miles. Meanwhile, in the Don Bend region, intense activity was unfolding. As the conflict persisted in the north, German assault units readied themselves to launch an offensive across the river at its closest point to the Volga. Initially scheduled for August 19th, the operation faced a 2-day delay and eventually commenced on August 21st, extending across a front spanning roughly 20 miles. By the following morning, 22 pontoon bridges had been assembled over the Don River, allowing German infantry and armored forces to resume their eastward advance. The push toward Volga was led by the 16th Panzer Division, with support from 2 motorized infantry divisions. On August 23rd, they launched their attack in the echelon from the Don bridgehead, rapidly covering the remaining 36 miles of the open steppe. This style of warfare played to the strengths of the Wehrmacht, as they bypassed strong defensive positions or addressed them with mobile assault groups breaking away from the main thrust. Had these tactics been employed in mid-July, Stalingrad would have been taken off the march. In late August, when the strategic aims of Blue had become transparently clear, and the Soviet High Command had recovered from its initial shock, they carried a serious element of risk. While Paulus's armored spearhead hurtled east over the broad flat plains, the full weight of the 4th Air Fleet was unleashed on Stalingrad. Massed formations of German bombers laid down a carpet of destruction. Firestorms swept through the wooden suburbs, claiming the lives of 40,000 people in just one day. The docks, administrative center, and extensive portions of the city's industrial core were reduced to ruins. Enormous columns of smoke hung in the sky, visible for miles around. Later that same day, the vanguard units of the 16th Panzer Division reached the Volga River, situated north of Stalingrad. While making their advance towards the Volga, the 16th Panzer Division had severed the southeast front from the Stalingrad front, but this move left them dangerously exposed. Following in their wake, the motorized infantry units encountered increasingly fierce resistance and struggled to keep the pace with the armored forces. With their backs against the Volga and dwindling supplies of fuel and ammunition, the 16th Panzer Division found themselves isolated. While the supporting infantry fought to break through and reinforce them, the 16th Panzer Division faced relentless Soviet counterattacks from the north and south. For 6 days, they clung tenaciously to their positions along the Volga, targeting river traffic with their artillery and launching sporadic assaults through the sprawling northern suburbs of Stalingrad. Above, the Luftwaffe continued its devastating campaign. Thousands of sorties were flown over the belligerent city, overwhelming the anti-aircraft defenses and driving Soviet fighters from the skies. With inexorable determination, Stalingrad on the Volga, once a renowned bastion to the Tsars and a gateway to Asia, was gradually reduced to a pile of rubble. Towards the end of August, the Soviet armies of the southeast front were being pressed relentlessly from the south and west. Between the Don and the Volga, a huge salient was formed by the northerly thrust of the 4th Panzer Army and the continuing pressure of the 6th Army's infantry. The Soviet left flank was held by the 57th and 51st Armies, and was safely anchored along a line of saltwater lakes. But the 62nd, and to an even greater extent the 64th, held dangerously exposed positions in the salient. On August the 29th, 4th Panzer mounted a major offensive through the center of the salient towards Stalingrad. The attack sliced into the rear of the 64th Army, threatening it and part of the 62nd with encirclement. 6th Army was ordered to detach mobile forces from the Volga corridor and strike quickly south to join up with the 4th Panzer spearhead. But the corridor was only just holding a subject to increasingly frantic attacks by the 4th Tank Army. The pressure in the north tied up 6th Army's mobile formations for 3 vital days, enabling the Soviet forces in the salient to conduct a fighting retreat, escaping eastward to the inner defense lines west of the Volga. Once again, the Germans had failed to achieve a major encirclement, further prolonging the campaign and ensuring that the fight for the city would be long and hard. At the end of August, General Zhukov assumed overall command of the Soviet forces in the south. Zhukov's task was to coordinate the various front commands, organize the defense of Stalingrad, and maintain pressure on the 6th Army's vulnerable left flank. In early September, while the German ring closed around the city, Zhukov mounted a series of offensives from the north. Though failing to break through the German cordon, the attacks helped to hinder the 6th Army's advance by diverting attention and forces from the center to the periphery. Meanwhile, Soviet reserves continued to flow south, some to reinforce the 62nd Army in Stalingrad, but many more to bolster the flanks and provide Zhukov with the necessary strength and flexibility to mount local counterattacks. In mid-September, Soviet pressure in the north eased off enough to allow Paulus to resume his efforts in Stalingrad. The city was now surrounded on 3 sides, and the Volga crossings were under fire from German artillery. On the 13th, the Germans attacked through the southern suburbs, edging forward under cover of airstrikes and supported by tanks and artillery. The objective was the main landing stage, handling ferry traffic from the east bank. Initially, the attacks made good ground. But as the Germans advanced, Soviet resistance began to intensify. Amid the ruins of the center city, they soon became bogged down in the vicious street fighting. General Chukov, commanding 62nd Army, reorganized and rallied the defenders, creating a series of mini-fortresses and funneling the Germans into killing zones. These were carefully mapped out, ringed with anti-tank weapons and precisely targeted by artillery batteries situated on the far shore. Gradually, the Germans fought their way forward, pressing in now from the north as well as the south. Some isolated strong points held out for days. Others changed hands several times. Often, the front line was no more than an interior wall, or the floor space separating different levels in the same building. Gains were measured in yards, weighed against the cost and casualties, and held onto desperately in the face of almost suicidal Soviet counterattacks. Overhead, clouds of bombers continued to pulverize what remained of the Soviet rear. Hardly a single building now remained intact. The landing areas were clogged with corpses, and the river channels with the hulks of burning ferries. Yet somehow or other, in small groups, Soviet reinforcements continued to get through. Those that reached the front were already veterans, survivors from the grim and perilous journey across the Volga. Stalingrad had become a place of horror, a vortex of fire and noise. The cacophony of small arms fire echoed ceaselessly, interrupted by the thunderous rumble of artillery, the shrill whine and thud of ordnance, and the deafening explosions of bombs. The combat grew increasingly fierce, intimate, and brutal. Even the city's drains and sewers became battlegrounds for intense skirmishes between heavily armed infiltration groups. In a series of such ruthless confrontations, impulsive assaults, and slow, grinding offensives, the German forces gradually advanced through the city's heart, inching closer to the Volga River. By the end of September, the Germans shifted their primary focus from the southern and central sectors of Stalingrad to the northern factory district. 3 imposing complexes dominated the skyline: the Red October, barricades, and tractor factories. These colossal concrete fortresses rose from a sea of rubble, with many of their workshops still churning out tanks, guns, and ammunition for the front lines. With the primary landing stage and much of the city center now under German control, these strongholds represented the last significant pockets of Soviet resistance. On October 3rd, the Germans launched an assault with 5 divisions along a 3-mile front. Tanks plowed over towering mounds of debris, engaging in close-quarters combat along streets choked with rubble. Following behind, infantry advanced cautiously, clearly aware of the hidden dangers lurking within the shadows of the shattered buildings. As it had in the south, the Germans' offensive in the north soon began to flag. The Russians contested every foot of ground, every floor and workshop. Factory workers and soldiers fought side by side. No quarter was given and no prisoners taken. For the Russian soldiers, now fighting with their backs to the Volga, there was no possibility of retreat left. Both sides brought in fresh reserves, and the battle raged fiercely amidst the craters and ruins. On October 14th, in a bid to maintain the momentum of the attack, Paulus committed the remaining reserves, pushing to within a few hundred yards of the Volga. The Germans now controlled 90% of the city, but the Russians clung to a fragile bridgehead, seemingly willing to sacrifice their lives to hold it. Paulus's troops were now not only physically exhausted, but faced with more pressing concerns. To achieve even this partial victory, he had, in the preceding weeks, stripped his flanks of nearly all their combat forces. He had also misled Hitler, greatly exaggerating the size of the Soviet force in Stalingrad, and reports were now coming in of significant Soviet troop concentrations on the flanks. Adding to the challenges, the first frost of winter had arrived earlier than anticipated. Biting cold winds blew in from the east, and snowflakes began to pepper the landscape of rubble, charred timbers, and the gray uniforms of his soldiers. Far to the south, the advance of German Army Group A had also ground to a halt, failing to fulfill its early promise. When Kleist's 1st Panzer Army reached Maykop, the oil fields were in flames, and the scale of destruction was so extensive that it would take a year's effort to restore them to operation. The remaining oil-producing areas lay south of the Caucasus, a 700-mile-long chain of untamed mountains stretching from the Black Sea to the Caspian Sea and crowned by the 18,000-foot-high peak of Mount Elbrus. There were few passes, and those that existed were high, tortuous, and easy to defend. Throughout August and September, German mountain troops had probed for a way through. As October arrived and the onset of winter rendered further attempts futile, the German forces remained far from achieving their objectives. While the 62nd Army continued to draw the Germans deeper into the Stalingrad cauldron, Zhukov was secretly amassing forces in preparation for his own offensive. Initially conceived as a response to Stalin's persistent calls for diversionary attacks against the flanks of the Sixth Army, the plan extended in scope and ambition as the battle for the city intensified and the flanks of the German forces became increasingly strained. To prepare for the launch of the offensive, the Soviet fronts underwent a reorganization. The old Stalingrad front was replaced with two new fronts, the Southwest Front and the Don Front. Simultaneously, the Southeast Front was renamed as the Stalingrad Front. The offensive was scheduled to unfold in two stages. In the first stage, the Soviet armies of the Southwest Front would launch an attack from the Don bridgeheads, driving south and east through the Don Bend toward the town of Kalach. In the second stage, timed for the following day, heavily reinforced formations positioned on the left wing of the Stalingrad front would launch an attack westward toward the Don, with the overarching goal of encircling the bulk of the German forces besieging Stalingrad. While the Soviet pincers cut through the German rear, the armies of the Don front, and even those on the battered right wing of the Stalingrad front, would continue to apply pressure in the center. Although ambitious, the plan was fundamentally sound, taking advantage of the increasing overextension of Axis forces in the Stalingrad sector. Most of the German 6th Army and all of the 4th Panzer Army were now concentrated between the Don and the Volga, leaving the flanks weakly held by 4 unreliable and understrength Axis satellite armies. Of these, it was upon the Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies that the main weight of the Soviet offensive would fall. Throughout October and early November, as the Russians completed their ground buildup, the Red Air Force gradually gained control of the skies. Initially, Soviet air operations in the Stalingrad sector were limited to nighttime or localized raids. However, with an increasing number of better aircraft becoming available, the defensive strategy was abandoned in favor of an all-out offensive approach. Aerial dominance in critical sectors of the battle zone was essential to ensure success on the ground. With over 1 million Russian soldiers poised to advance against the Axis lines, concealing the final deployments would be challenging. German reconnaissance efforts had to be thwarted, and as the offensive commenced, Soviet breakthrough forces would require effective fighter cover and tactical air support. On November 19th, at the Don River, the Soviet offensive began with concentrated artillery barrages targeting the Romanian positions facing the Southwest Front. The barrage proved devastating. In the days leading up to the offensive, thousands of guns, mortars, and Katyusha rocket launchers had been secretly assembled in narrow breakthrough sectors. In a crescendo of firepower, the Romanian lines were torn apart, trenches obliterated, and bunkers and pillboxes reduced to rubble. By midday, the Romanian Third Army had been pushed aside, and Soviet tanks and infantry swarmed over the plains. The following day marked the launch of the second stage of the offensive against the Romanian Fourth Army in the Don-Volga Isthmus. Once again, the great swirling mass of Soviet armor and infantry overwhelmed the defense. Russian cavalry steamed through the gaps. Army Group B was in chaos. In all sectors, the pressure was intense. Attacks were launched against 6th Army's position in the Don Bend, against 4th Panzer to the south of Stalingrad, and out of the Stalingrad bridgehead itself. Surrounded on all sides and subjected to relentless air harassment, the German forces in the Stalingrad sector found themselves unable to react swiftly enough to halt the advancing tide. 3 days later, following a swift advance through the Don Bend, Soviet forces from the Southwest Front connected with those from the Stalingrad Front, completing the encirclement of the formidable German 6th Army and most of the 4th Panzer Army. As the Russians urgently bolstered their encircling ring, the fighting with Stalingrad persisted. The 62nd Army under Chuikov, emboldened by reports of the disaster that had befallen the 6th Army, fought with renewed confidence and determination. Finally, there was not only hope for relief, but also for a heroic and decisive victory against overwhelming odds. On 3 occasions, while the opportunity still existed, Paulus sought permission to launch a breakout to the southwest. Each time, his request was denied by Hitler, who refused to entertain any withdrawal from the Volga. Stalingrad was to be transformed into a fortress, and until 6th Army could be relieved, it would rely on airlift for supplies. From the outset, the airlift support for 6th Army fell significantly short of even the most basic requirements. Of the 500 tons per day promised to Paulus, less than 100 tons were actually delivered. Stocks of food, ammunition, and fuel gradually diminished, leaving 6th Army increasingly immobile and vulnerable. Unless the situation improved, the 300,000 German and Romanian troops trapped in the pocket would be slowly starved into submission. At the end of November, Hitler created Army Group Don to hold the line between Army Groups A and B. Army Group Don, under the command of General Erich von Manstein, consisted of the 6th Army within the Stalingrad pocket. This now included the encirclement elements of the 4th Panzer Army, remnants of the 4th Romanian Army, and a reconstituted 4th Panzer Army hastily assembled from support units and fortified by 4 weaker panzer divisions. Manstein's plan aimed to launch an attack through the Don-Volga Isthmus, targeting the area where the Russian infantry was most vulnerable. This offensive was designed to facilitate the breakout of the 6th Army into the southwest. However, this plan faced 2 significant obstacles. The first was Hitler's adamant opposition to any withdrawal from the Volga. The second, unbeknownst to Manstein, was the Soviet preparation for their first own offensive. The Soviet offensive would be executed by the Voronezh and Southwest fronts, targeting the Italian 8th Army on the right flank of Army Group B. The objective was to sever all German forces south of the Don River. Meanwhile, the Don and Stalingrad fronts would continue to exert pressure on the 6th Army within the Stalingrad pocket and repel any attempts at relief. Despite careful planning and tactical support from the Luftwaffe, Manstein's relief offensive had limited prospects for success. With only 2 armored divisions dedicated to the attack, there was no realistic chance of creating a permanent corridor across the 60 miles of snow-covered steppe to reach Stalingrad. At best, Manstein's forces could advance partially, disrupt the Soviet forces within the encirclement, and offer one final opportunity for the 6th Army to attempt a breakout. Inevitably, on December the 19th, after a week of heavy fighting, the relief offensive was finally brought to a halt along the line of the Mishkova River, barely halfway to Stalingrad. For a further 5 days, the Germans held these positions in the forlorn hope that Paulus would defy Hitler's express command and order the 6th Army to attempt a breakout. For Army Group Don, the situation grew increasingly dire with each passing day. On December 16th, the Russians swiftly penetrated the Italian 8th Army, devastating 5 of its divisions and plunging the rest into chaos. A dangerous gap, approximately 90 miles wide, had now been opened between Army Groups B and Don. By Christmas Eve, the relief forces stationed in the Don-Volga Isthmus started withdrawing from their advanced positions along the Mishkova River. At the same time, Army Group A was covertly preparing to abandon the Caucasus region. The fate of the 6th Army had become inevitable. Throughout January 1943, the Russians continued to tighten the encirclement around the 6th Army while simultaneously pushing westward across the Don and the Donets River toward Rostov. On January 12th, a significant Soviet offensive struck the Hungarian 2nd Army in the Upper Don region, effectively completing the destruction of Axis satellite armies in Russia. As Soviet armor units advanced through the Donets corridor toward Kharkov, the Germans scrambled desperately to close the gaps and stabilize the front line. All the gains made during Operation Blue were rapidly abandoned. Only the 6th Army remained in its position, but it was completely encircled and increasingly isolated within the ruins of Stalingrad. The final phase of the Russian assault on the 6th Army commenced on January 22nd. By now, the Stalingrad pocket had been reduced to a third of its original size, and the 6th Army was separated from Army Group Don by 160 miles of steppe. That day, the Russians overran the last serviceable airfield available to Paulus. For 10 more days, the survivors of the 6th Army fought on the limits of their strength and endurance. Soviet attacks on road from every direction. On January the 25th, Russian troops advanced from the west, linked up with units of the 62nd Army in the Volga bridgehead. 6th Army was now cut in half and reduced to fighting for a few square miles of frozen rubble. On January the 31st, the Battle of Stalingrad ended for General Paulus, only that day promoted to Field Marshal by Hitler. He had, as he had been ordered, held out until the last possible moment, surrendering only when the Russians reached to the door of his headquarters. The capitulation of Paulus brought the fighting in the southern enclave to an end. But in the northern enclave, the killing went for a further 2 days. The last pockets of resistance in the north were not liquidated until February the 2nd, and only then, at the cost of several thousand more lives. Those who emerged from the ruins of the factory district had fought on relentlessly, without hope, until they exhausted their ammunition and strength. They were weary, on the brink of starvation, and many suffered from untreated wounds or frostbite. Yet, they harbored few illusions about their fate. In Stalingrad, the war had descended to new depths of squalor. Men had been sent into the slaughter with seemingly little regard for their lives. Many had become hardened and indifferent to the suffering of others. On both sides, the killing of prisoners had become a common practice, and for the survivors of the 6th Army, the ordeal was far from over. Out of the 110,000 German soldiers taken prisoner by the Russians, including 24 generals, only 5,000 would ever return to Germany. The defeat at Stalingrad was a catastrophic blow to the Wehrmacht. 20 German divisions were erased from the order of battle, and many more were severely weakened. The 6th Army was utterly annihilated, along with 6 months' worth of the Reich's war production. Furthermore, the armies of Italy, Hungary, and Romania were either demolished or routed from the battlefield, while all the lands to the east and south of the Don River fell into Russian hands. To the west of the Don, the German retreat continued into the early months of 1943. Army Group A was withdrawn from the Caucasus, and Army Group B fell back across the Donets. Kharkov was abandoned and then recaptured in a brilliantly executed counteroffensive, but this marked the Wehrmacht's last significant victory in the east. The losses sustained during Operation Blue had been devastating and could never be fully replenished. In the months and years ahead, the German military found itself increasingly isolated, abandoned one by its Axis partners, and facing a resurgent Red Army that had gained fresh reserves of strength from its victory in Stalingrad.
This is the story of an American air operation. One small campaign in the greatest aerial offensive of this war. In a sense, it is more than the story of a military operation. These planes, high in the skies over Germany, were a symbol of the unshakable unity of the Allies, in their determination to fight together until victory and peace had been achieved. June 2nd, 1944. On this day, 650 American flying fortresses inflicted severe damage on German defenses along the invasion coast. Far Farther north, 300 American liberators bombed military installations in German-occupied northwestern Europe. Flak was heavy over some targets. 8 of our planes did not return to their bases. On this same day, June 2nd, 1944, a task force of 150 flying fortresses, escorted by 70 fighter planes, attacked railroad and marshalling yards at Debrecen, Hungary. None of these planes returned to their bases on this day. June 21st, 1944, 300 liberators bombed the Focke-Wulf 190 engine factory at Bosdorf, Germany. An hour later, 800 flying fortresses attacked targets at Berlin, Germany. Damage was inflicted on railway stations, freight yards, and factories. Bombs were also dropped on the ministries of war and propaganda, as well as Gestapo headquarters. Over all these targets, flak was intense and accurate. Interception strong and determined. Three German planes were shot down. "38 of our own planes did not return to their bases. And on this same day, at about the same time, 155 flying fortresses, escorted by fighters, bombed synthetic oil plants and refineries at Ruhland, 70 miles east of Leipzig, Germany. As on June 2nd, none of these planes returned to their bases on this day. This was not a coincidence, and these planes were not lost in action. This had been decided 6 months before, on December 7th, 1943, when at Tehran, the leaders of the 3 major Allied powers had declared their complete agreement as to the scope and timing of operations from the east, west, and south. Operations from the east, west, and south. Operations on land, on sea, and in the air.
The U.S.S.R. agrees to furnish bases in Russia for the use of the U.S. strategical air forces in Europe, such bases to be used for shuttle bombing operations.
Operation Titanic. Shuttle bombing. With American air bases in Russia, our bombers based in England and Italy could attack objectives in Central Europe, the Balkans, or Eastern Germany, land in Russia, refuel, reload, and bomb additional enemy targets on their return trips to their home bases. Operation Titanic. A triangular superhighway in the sky. With shuttle bombing, flying distances from England to some extreme points in eastern Germany and Poland, and from Italy to some points in German-occupied Hungary and the Balkans, would be reduced by a third. Reduced flying distance means reduced danger. For while planes on the shuttle route would have already landed, planes making the round-trip run still have to face flak, interception, or engine failure. With shuttle bombing, strategic targets of importance to the Red Army could be bombed by American planes operating from Russian bases. With shuttle bombing, Germany and the Luftwaffe could never be quite sure where the next Allied air blow was coming from, or going to. With shuttle bombing, the coalition land war, crushing the Wehrmacht on 3 fronts, would take wings to become coalition air war, and there would be no target in Germany or German-occupied Europe American planes could not seek, find, and destroy. These were the strategic purposes of Operation Titanic. The task of achieving these purposes was assigned to Lieutenant General Carl A. Spaatz, Commanding General of the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, and became the responsibility of Major General Frederick L. Anderson, Deputy Commanding General for Operations. In 4 months, the new bases were to be selected, constructed, supplied, staffed, and ready for use. A problem in men, materiel, space, time, and secrecy, requiring food, gasoline, bombs, ammunition, trucks, jeeps, steel matting, and more than 20,000 tons of other equipment, to be shipped by convoy from Liverpool and other British ports through the North Atlantic and Arctic Oceans. 2,000 miles of submarine-infested waters. Then from Murmansk, the Soviets' Arctic ice-free port, by rail. An additional 2,000 miles. Radio equipment to be flown by ATC from the United States to Russia. A distance of 5,000 miles. Oil and more gasoline by tank car from Iran and British surplus stocks in the Middle East. 3,000 miles. A task force of expert ground crews transported from the United Kingdom to Cairo through the South Atlantic and the Mediterranean. By rail from Egypt to Palestine. By motor convoy through the Holy Land and Iraq. Then up and over the snow-covered mountains of northern Persia to the southernmost end of the Russian Trans-Caucasian Railroad at Tabriz. Finally, by special train over the Caucasian Mountains to their new headquarters somewhere in Russia. A secret journey of more than 7,000 miles. By the end of 4 months, the bases were ready. And Ambassador Averill W. Harriman and Major General John R. Dean, head of the United States military mission at Moscow, landed on the first American airbase on Russian soil. Now, with preparation and organization completed, the task of transforming theory into reality was assigned to the 8th American Air Force, based somewhere in England, and the 15th Air Force, based somewhere in Italy. Early in the morning of June 2nd, crews of bomber and fighter commands of the 15th Air Force were assembled to be briefed for a special mission. A special mission for pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and gunners. And finally, a special word of farewell from Major General Twining, Commanding General of the 15th Air Force.
I do not have to impress you with the importance of this mission to the Russian bases. I'm sure you are fully aware of this important event. I would like to mention one thing about which you must be very particular. That is your conduct while at these Russian bases. Be soldierly and neat at all times. The Russian is a fine soldier who appreciates results and one who does not understand big talk. Wish you the best of luck. Goodbye.
At 0600 hours, the bombers took off. With Lieutenant General Ira C. Aker, Commanding General of the Mediterranean Allied Air Forces, in personal command of the task force, the fortresses left the ground with clockwork precision. 1 fort every 30 seconds. At 0630 hours, their fighter escort followed them into the air. 70 planes in 17.5 minutes. At 0730 hours, the bombers and the first relay of fighters made rendezvous over the Adriatic, and Titanic 1 was on its way. If the shuttle route to Russia was equally practical from England, was now to be proved by the 8th Air Force. 0100 hours, the morning of June 21st, somewhere in England. Titanic 2 At 0530 hours, the heavily loaded bombers took off into the fog of an English dawn. 24 minutes later, the first group was in the air, heading northeast to the task force assembly point. At 0800 hours, 2 by 2, the last relay of fighters left the ground. At 0930 hours, flying fortresses and Mustangs made rendezvous high over the German coast, and Titanic II was on its way. At 1200 hours, it dropped its bombs on the Ruland oil fields and continued to its new bases somewhere in Russia. That is why on June 2nd, and again on June 21st, American planes did not return to their bases somewhere in Italy or England. For on each of those days, their mission was still unfinished. In a sense, it had only begun.
$1,500 hours. What was left of our target was a good 3 hours behind us. But we were still in enemy skies, and we could see the P-51s that were escorting us all the way in, prowling in the skies above. They called us Big Friend. We called them Little Friend. And it was a very pleasant feeling to have them around. About 1600 hours, we saw our red-nosed little friends pull away. A couple of minutes later, our navigator, the little man with the big maps, made with the instruments, and gave us the good word.
Navigator to crew. Navigator to crew. It won't be long now. We're over Russia.
Over Russia. From the sky, all countries look alike. But this was friendly country. That meant no more flak, no danger of interception. Solid ground not too far away. It meant a new country, a new people. A lives we'd heard about, read about, but never seen. How do you get along with people you can't even talk to? Would we like them? Would they like us?
To greet the task force are General Walsh and General Permanov, the American and Russian COs.
Coming in, Base X looked like any other American airfield. Neat rows of GI tents. Runways dotted with B-17s. Ground crews at the edge of the field, their faces to the sky. One difference, though, the ruins all around the base. A silent reminder that enemy boots had marched in two directions here quite recently.
The forts follow each other down, a third of a world away from home. Wheels made in Akron touch steel matting made in Pittsburgh on an American landing field in Russia. Gower, Messick, Ostrander, Zafak, Malone, Schultz, Badowski, Travers, McGee, Stanley, Rudenstein, Betts. 1,000 tourists from 48 states on a short visit between two jobs. Tense moment in international relations. Ivan Ivanovich meets fearless Fosdick. A handshake says, "Hello, very glad to see you," in any language. And General Permanov makes it official.
Я приветствую вас.
I welcome you as fighting allies. Together we'll fight to victory.
Я желаю
I wish you the best of luck in combat and a safe return home.
возвращения домой.
After that, there was another important ceremony. Short snorter bills. If we didn't get those signed, the flight would have been illegal. Whenever flyers meet, they talk shop, even when they can't understand each other. That's when sign language came in handy. And it seemed to work at that. Some Russian WACs, officers, and enlisted women were on the welcoming committee too. It would have been nice to sort of pursue the subject further, but there was work to be done.
Interrogation. The reports and odds and ends of information that lay the groundwork for future operations. Interrogation is held in the open by courtesy of retreating German troops.
Did you meet any fighter opposition to this? All right. How many fighters did you see?
I said about 15.
About 15?
Yeah.
With interrogation over, the men head for the tents, which will be their home as long as they remain in Russia. The first half of the mission is ended. The second half has already begun. Without the loss of an hour, the mixed ground crews of American and Russian mechanics take over the big bombers. Inspecting damages. Checking engines. Repairing equipment. Getting the fortresses ready for another trip.
Okay.
Spasiba.
Kuchnia. Kuchnia stands for kitchen. Kitchen stands for chow. And even in Russia, you stand in line for it. On KP duty, Katya, Manya, and Olga. Not Buck or Eddie or Pete, but soldiers too. And darn good cooks to boot, who cooked and served our supper.
Hutch, Pajolista.
K-ration, with a Russian accent. And spam a la Stroganoff. The coffee was hot. That's about all you could say for it. The name was Mashinka. Back at the field, the ground crew stayed with the bombers as long as there was light, making sure that nothing happened that shouldn't when the B-17s went up again.
2100 hours. 9 in the evening. Somewhere in Russia. It's noon in Leominster, Massachusetts. Lunchtime. It's 10 in the morning in Paragould, Arkansas. The sun is climbing high. In Los Angeles, California, the day is just beginning. The same day, just ending, somewhere in Russia. Small world. Another day, just beginning, somewhere in Russia.
Let's go.
Another working day. Another day of war. At headquarters, American officers headed by Colonel, now General Albert A. Kessler, and their Russian colleagues plan the next mission. Objective, the destruction of one of several strategic targets in the path of the Red Army. The target is selected. Weather permitting, mission tomorrow. A task force of this size needs gasoline, more than 350,000 gallons of it. Ammunition, more than 1 million rounds. Bombs, more than 500 tons. And more than 50,000 American and Russian man-hours of servicing and preparation.
While the ground crews got the forts and fighters ready, our time was our own. Some of the fellows took advantage of a sunny morning and put on an exhibition of the national pastime. Some thought they'd teach the Russians another American pastime. And learned that others had taught too well before them. Some tried to bridge the distance home. To let the folks know their wandering boy was somewhere in Russia last night. Some of us, over lunch of borscht and kasha, talked over tricks of the trade with the Russian fighter pilots, whose small, fast yaks are part of the field's defenses, constantly on the alert. Some tried to preserve the more exotic aspects of Base X, like the American nurses that are stationed there, perfectly at home abroad. Some discussed with the Russians current events, literature, yeah, sports.
Like that?
And art.
Это хорошо. Это дело другое.
Some moseyed over to a nearby pasture and found out that milking a cow in Russia is no different than it is in Iowa. And some of us, explorers at heart, decided to see Russia. The town near the base is a market center for the adjacent farming district, and a fair was held each year along its main street. The factory section. Principal industry, the manufacture of leather goods. The Ukrainian Museum, well known for its collection of historical treasures and valuable objects of art. The grave of the famous Ukrainian writer, Korolenko, and his home. The population of the town, 130,000 at the last census, has varied in recent years, and there has been a certain decline in the number of children of school age. Those who have remained, or who have returned from the interior, have recently developed a fondness for an American import known as chvachka. Translation, gum. On the way back to the base, a few miles from the town, there's a monument to a Russian victory over an invading army 200 years ago.
Следующий номер. Украинские народные песни в исполнении хора имени Шевченко. Next number. Ukrainian folk songs by the Shevchenko choir.
The language and the music are strange, but it isn't necessary to understand the language to understand some of the people here. The show marks the beginning of the end of this American visit to Russia. Most of the men are already looking back. remembering. Lieutenant John Morris, navigator of Nanticoke, Pennsylvania, who has the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Air Medal with 4 clusters, was particularly impressed by the medals worn by the Russian soldiers.
They don't wear ribbons like we do, but the actual medals. Practically every Russian soldier I ran into was loaded with decorations.
Captain Percy W. Stressing, pilot of Rochester, New York, thought the show explained a lot about the Russian people.
Those Russians sure like to sing and dance. One of the numbers was kind of a tap dance. I think the Russians resemble Americans in a lot of ways. They've got a great sense of humor. They can laugh and enjoy everything, even though their whole country is in ruins.
Major Samuel Davis, command pilot of Boston, Massachusetts.
It was good to relax and listen to music and laugh, but you could never forget there was a war on here. Most everybody was in uniform, men, women, even children. I saw a lot of kids who'd been through plenty of action. Some of them who had medals to prove it couldn't have been more than 10 or 12 years old. One of the other fellows told me he ran into one kid who'd been a sniper with the guerrillas and had 21 notches on his rifle butt. A sniper with the guerrillas at his age.
Technical Sergeant Louis Zerlnik, engineer gunner of Brooklyn, New York, spent a lot of time with the Russian ground crews.
Some of the men on the show, and quite a few around the base too, have been wounded as much as 3 or 4 times. They were working on the base for a rest before going back into combat. Those Russians sure have funny ideas about resting.
Staff Sergeant John E. Gagan, tail gunner of Paterson, New Jersey.
The show was pretty good. As far as I could see, everybody liked it, including General Aker. He was sitting in the first row with General Permanov or something like that, the Russian base commander.
Lieutenant John Mackenzie, bombardier of Paragould, Arkansas.
Something I'll remember for a long time were the Russian kids. You got the feeling some of them never had a childhood. They had such old faces. They were pretty shy, most of them, but they seemed to like us.
Technical Sergeant Clinton Miller, engineer gunner of Montvale, New Jersey.
The Russians like their dance music slow and sentimental, mostly waltzes. The girls do all kinds of jobs around the base, and they work very hard. Their clothes are plain and neat. They don't use makeup as a rule, but some of them wear lipstick. I remember one girl who was in charge of an ACAC crew. She had 12 enemy planes to her credit.
Staff Sergeant Donald Craw, tail gunner of Stratford, Connecticut.
The music at the dance was on the corny side, but the girls are nice. I met a girl from Leningrad whose father was a general. She taught me some Russian words, and I taught her some American slang. It didn't take long before I was saying, "Horror-shaw," and she was saying, "Okay, bud."
Weather? Okay.
Takeoff, 0900 hours. Taxi out, 0845. Stations, 0840. Briefing, 0600 hours.
Briefing.
0R 1320. Your altitude will be 22,000 feet, which is your bombing altitude. And the place will be the target.
Target for today. It may be a locomotive works in Poland, an aerodrome in Hungary, an oil field in Romania, or a tank factory in Germany itself. Whatever the target, today's mission will prove again that no objective in German Europe is secure from American bombers.
Your group and wing assembly will be at 12,000 feet over the base. Your bombing altitude will be 22,000 feet. We'll pick up our fighter escort over the front at 11:43. Target time, 13:20. Gas load, 2,700. Bomb load, 10 500-pound GPs.
Bomb load, 10 500-pound GPs. GP, general purpose. General purpose, to reduce the enemy's mobility, to disrupt his lines of communication, reinforcement, and supply, to destroy his war machine at its very source, his mines, his mills, his factories, and to deliver a message.
До свидания и счастливый путь.
That means good luck. We'll be seeing you. During the summer of 1944, 3,800 American planes made the shuttle run to and from Russia over this aerial highway. In less than 4 months, 24 targets in Germany and German-held territories, some never before within effective range of our bombers, felt the lash of American air power, striking against railway centers and marshalling yards at Debrecen and Szolnok, Hungary, Bucharest, and Ered, Romania, and Béziers, France, against airdromes at Galatz, Foksani, Buzău, and Celestia, Romania, Mielec, Poland, Kecskemés, Hungary, and Toulouse, France, against oil fields and refineries at Rulan, Germany, Drohobych, and Tercovina, Poland, Budapest, Hungary, and Ploiesti, Romania, against armament plants and aircraft factories at Gdynia, Poland, Miskolc, and Diosfior, Hungary, and Chemnitz, Germany. But even more important, this bomb and 10,000 more like it destroyed more than German factories, German oil depots, German railroads. They smashed Germany's last hope of escaping defeat by dividing the Allies.
Never before have the major Allies been more closely united. and they are determined to continue to be united, so that the ideal of lasting peace will become a reality.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the DroneScapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, Thank you for watching.